Sociology 345, Video Lecture 01. We were talking last time about different ways to think about culture, and we started with ancient Greece, 400 BC, the ideas of Plato and Aristotle, and we saw how we could find those ideas also appearing in late 19th century Germany and England. And we said these are all ideas basically of reflection. Plato and Aristotle's different ideas about how culture worked to reflect reality or truth. And then in the late 19th century, Matthew Arnold and Karl Marx also offering ideas about reflection and the relationship between what culture is and what society is. We're going to return to late 19th century, early 20th century Germany, and then we're going to bring ourselves up to the late 20th century United States. We're going to add to the idea of reflection the idea of Verstehen. Verstehen is a German word associated with the German tradition of sociology, German tradition of philosophy, roughly translated as a meaningful understanding or having to do with interpretation. It's an idea that fits well with our understanding of social constructionism, the idea that society is built up by people through their actions from the bottom to the top. The term is usually used in describing interpretive sociology, which again is interested in people's actions, the fact that people's actions are based on the understandings that people have of the world, the meanings that they have created for the world and for themselves. And so the focus of an interpretive sociology is really people and meanings, ideologies, and actions that spring from them. So we start with Max Weber. I said we would return to Germany and the late 19th century. So we have Max Weber, one of the founding figures of sociology. We usually say that Weber and Marx and the French sociologist Emile Durkheim are the founding figures of this discipline that emerged in this time period, again, in response to these massive and rapid social changes and all the associated issues and problems that resulted from them. Max Weber came from a wealthy and politically active family, was an accomplished economist and historian, and again, one of the developers of this new idea of sociology. His most famous work is a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Really created this idea, or gave form to this idea of the work ethic, the Protestant ethic. It's an idea we use all the time now to talk about people's work ethic. It's got a moral dimension. We talk about people being good or bad, essentially by whether or not they're willing to work, how hard they'll work, etc. So his idea was really an attempt to explain capitalism, not unlike Marx, who wanted to explain this new economic system that became very powerful very rapidly. Weber's idea was that you needed to understand the meanings of this system, the ideologies that made this system work. So his idea really was that culture, or ideology, in this case a Protestant ideology, really drove society, really drove the capitalist system in its early form and made it powerful and made it take off. Two ideas that are important for understanding the spirit of capitalism are these cultural values, cultural ideas about the calling and predestination. To understand those ideas, you have to think back to Luther and the Protestant Reformation, the critique of the Catholic Church in the 1500s, major religious change, when Luther argued against the Catholic Church that people could be saved through their own faith alone, a new kind of doctrine, a critique of the church and the organization of the church. The idea in Catholicism was that one was granted salvation by the institution, by the church. That is, people sinned, They confessed their sins to the church, they demonstrated their faith to the church, and they were granted salvation in God's name. Luther, responding and reacting to what he saw as a great deal of corruption in this practice, people essentially buying their salvation, made the argument and created this new kind of ethic that people could be saved on their own through their own relationship to their God. This gave rise to the idea, this Protestant idea of the calling, the idea that there was a religious aspect to one's everyday activity, that everyone had a place in the overall scheme of things, and one demonstrated their faith by being true to that particular calling. The other important idea that comes out of the Protestant Reformation, associated most strongly with the Calvinists, is the idea of predestination. That is, one cannot be granted salvation by an organization or institution, by the church, but rather one's salvation is predestined. One, at one's birth, I guess before one's birth, it's already been decided by God whether or not you are destined to be saved or damned. You're either going to heaven or you're going to hell. And that's just the way it is. As you can imagine, this creates a deep kind of psychological anxiety. What are the assurances that you're a good person? How do you know? You can't really know, but what developed out of this psychological need was the idea that you could sort of demonstrate, or maybe if you could show that you engaged your worldly activity in good ways, that you had self-control, that you denied yourself pleasure and worked hard and amassed capital and reinvested it, that these might be clues, they might be a demonstration that you were one of the saved. So we get this idea that you can give yourself some self-assurance by working hard, by exhibiting self-control, by being purposeful in your activity, by not being frivolous. This is where we get this stereotype of the Calvinist as being a very serious, sort of stern kind of person, kind of personality. The idea that each person has a place in the overall scheme, and the pursuit of one's vocation, this calling, demonstrates that you are serving God. What this creates, among other things, is a kind of moral bookkeeping, kind of self-control, where people are constantly self-monitoring their actions and the actions of others. And it really gave rise to this early form of capitalism, not the kind of greedy consumer capitalism that we usually think of today, where people amass money for pleasure, to buy goods and to enjoy their earnings, but rather this ascetic kind of capitalism, where you amass wealth for the purpose of amassing wealth and reinvesting it and building and growing. This is Weber's explanation of how capitalism worked in its early form and why it took off and became so powerful so quickly, and especially powerful amongst the Protestant groups. It was because of its ideas, because of its culture. It was really culture driving this economic system. So that's this idea of verstehen. You want to understand things by understanding the meanings that people are creating for themselves, and then the actions they're undertaking based on those meanings. You're not interested in whether their meanings are correct or incorrect, moral or immoral. You're just understanding in what their ideas are, what their meanings are, where they come from, and how they act based on those meanings. And that helps us to understand what's going on. Now we can jump ahead to present time and the ideas of Wendy Griswold, who's an American sociologist associated with Northwestern University and the University of Chicago. She developed in the late 20th century this idea of the cultural diamond. It's also part of this Verstehen tradition, I think. I don't know if she would say so or not, but I think so. She created this it's not a theory of culture, it's a tool. to help us understand how culture operates in the social world. So you want to think about this diamond, she said, that is connected by arrows. That is, each point on the diamond is an arrow pointing in every direction, so everything's connected in this. And to create an understanding, to practice Verstehen or interpretive sociology, you can use this tool, and we'll try to use it at various points throughout the semester, to understand what's going on with a particular culture or a particular society at a particular point in time, and the people who are the audiences or the practitioners of that culture or the creators of that culture. The idea is that a cultural object down here at the bottom of the diamond is defined as shared significance embodied in form. That's just a kind of open definition so that we can understand culture as both, the cultural object as both possibly a material object, an artifact, like a chair or a table or an iPad or an iPhone, or a less material thing like a play, a poem, a movie, a television show, or even an idea, ideal culture as like an ideology or a set of values. So the cultural object can be any of those things. The social world is, well, what it sounds like, our definition of society, the organizations and institutions and social structures and all of these things at a given point in time. And then the creator who creates an object, who makes it, and the receiver, the audience or the practitioner involved. And to understand culture, you've got to understand all these aspects, all these different points of the diamond. And I'll just give you one example to finish up here so it gives you an idea of how it works. Let's take, for our cultural object, let's say, we'll start down here and we'll say, cultural object could be like an action-adventure film, or the whole genre of action-adventure movies. Okay, action-adventure movies became very popular in a particular social world, Hollywood and the United States, created by Hollywood producers for a particular set of audiences at a particular time, at the 1980s, mid-80s through the 90s. This kind of film became super popular, came to sort of dominate box office numbers. Well, why is that? Well, one obvious explanation, and people have advanced this idea, is that we live in a violent social world, and the cultural object just reflects that. And that's because our audience is part of this violent social world. They want to see this kind of stuff, and creators, want to respond to the receivers, and they understand this stuff because they're part of the world, and so they create this thing. Of course, you could take exactly the opposite view. You could say, well, for whatever reason, the creators created this object. It creates a violent social world. Receivers see this stuff, they act on the basis of these values and ideologies, and they end up acting in violent ways. And so you've got a different kind of reflection idea, both plausible. Well, we can complicate it even further. And I think this is actually the more accurate explanation. We can say, well, who really is the receiver of these things? If we look carefully at the social world and the economics of Hollywood in the mid-80s through the 90s, we see that this is a period in which international marketing of films became very important. It's a period in which actually marketing the film overseas became a huge concern, because that was where a great deal of money was being made, maybe even more money than was being made on the original release of the film in the United States. Maybe not so with the blockbusters, but with a lot of these. You can make more money marketing this thing after it had shown in the United States and showing it in these different markets around the world. Well, there's a certain kind of economics. This is part of the social world. There's a certain kind of economics associated with that. If you've got a film and you want to market it in another country other than the United States where they speak a different language, you've got to do something. It should be obvious. You've either got to dub the film into that language or you've got to subtitle the film. It's a second, third, fourth, whatever, a new step in the production of the film. Well, what's more economically viable in terms of dubbing and subtitling? It's expensive to dub and subtitle. You got to hire actors to do the dubbing or a firm to do the subtitling. A film with very little dialogue is going to be much cheaper to dub or subtitle and is going to potentially make a lot more money on the foreign market. It's a basic capitalism, keeps costs down, keeps the profit margin high. And so that's actually a very powerful explanation for why these kinds of action adventure films became popular during this period. It's because a new kind of market arose out of the particular economics of that social world, and the creators were responding to that. They weren't really responding to the psychology of their American audience. It wasn't really necessarily about the meanings of violence and whether or not these things cause violence or reacted to violence. It was more the idea that, well, you can make more money with this kind of film because we're making money in the foreign market, the overseas market, and the best way to do that is to keep costs down. And you keep costs down by making movies that don't have much dialogue. What kind of movies don't have much dialogue? Action adventure, violent action adventure movies. You don't have to dub or subtitle lots of explosions and machine guns, or Arnold Schwarzenegger grunting and yelling. So you get the idea. This cultural diamond we're going to come back to throughout the semester. It's a heuristic tool. It's a tool for brainstorming. It's a tool that lets you practice interpretive sociology in very effective ways because it asks you to account for each aspect of the diamond. And every time you come to an explanation, you have to move on to the next point and think it through again. And it never kind of stops. You just have to keep working until you find the most plausible explanation. So again, it's part of reflection theory. We're looking at how ideas are reflected in objects and in the social world and how creators and receivers are responding to those ideas. And it's part of Verstehen, or interpretive sociology, because we really want to understand all the motivations and all the actions of all the social actors involved. So there you have it, all the way from 400 BC Greece to really to the present day, basic ideas of reflection and interpretation that we'll come back to over and over again during the semester, and the idea of the cultural diamond.